Hello everybody, welcome back to the Overlap Breakdown channel. I'm joined as always by my co-host Umir, who's a professional football analyst and scout. And today we're here to cover Enzo Maresca's tactics as his Chelsea dominated Tottenham this weekend. And I know the final score was 4-3, and it doesn't seem like Chelsea dominated, as we're saying, in terms of the whole game, I think it was very distinct that Chelsea were the better team in this game. It's now one clean sheet in 22 Premier League home games for Spurs, which in itself is ridiculous. And no other team has picked up more wins at the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium than Chelsea since they moved there, which is obviously apart from Spurs. Just going straight off, I want you to talk about, because we've not really covered Enzo Maresca's Chelsea so far in the channel. I think me and you were talking. We were waiting for, not a statement victory, because we've had a lot of statement victories, but we were waiting for a needle mover, a game that was like...
That kind of showcases his philosophy.
Yeah, philosophy, adaptability, the way he shifts, in-game tweaks, stuff like that. And I want you to just start right off from the top with how they approached this game and what they looked like.
Yeah, so I think a fairly similar Maresca team. No huge changes, maybe in some of the personnel, but shape-wise, pretty identical to what we've seen from Maresca so far this season. Sanchez obviously in goal. We had Badiashile in this position to start the game, and Caicedo in at right back. It didn't look like that for most of the first half, because in possession, Caicedo moved into the midfield, Badiashile played as this right central defender. Colwill here as this left central defender became the middle of a back three. Cucurella was the other. I'll just move it here. It was the other defender. Caicedo obviously moved inside. Let's say if this was Cole Palmer, he's pushed up. And you've got Enzo as well, who's pushed up into these areas. Lavia, Caicedo, Enzo, Palmer formed this box. Neto and Sancho as the wingers. And then you had Jackson up top. And then, obviously, out of possession, you move back. This would be Palmer. Enzo dropping back and forming that midfield two out of possession. And that was generally how Chelsea did set up. For large parts of that first half, I thought they were really nice. And I thought that their system made sense. People talk about some of the tweaks that happened in the second half. I think they were more personnel related, because the shape did remain largely like this. But Enzo got players in their preferred sides and in preferred areas to better some of Spurs' weaknesses, and we'll touch on those as we go along.
So one thing we want to touch on really quickly about Chelsea is their positional rotations when they're on the ball. We often speak about off-ball, on-ball structures, and Chelsea, when they're going through deep goalkeeper build-up, we can often see exactly what you've got up here, which is the three centre-backs with Robert Sanchez stepped up into right centre-half from goalkeeper, and that is to provide a +1 in the build-up so they can find a spare man. But this shape doesn't really... We often see teams going from like a 4-2 settled defence, and then they just go into like 2 and a 1 or a 3 and a 1. Chelsea start the build-up phase exactly how they want to play through the thirds, and it means that there's no real rotations. The only rotation, if it's even classed as one, is Colwill moving from the left centre of the box to the middle.
Yeah, it kind of looks like this. So I think that one of the hallmarks of a Maresca side is keeping this box midfield in there, because you want to outnumber your players. Yeah. And they focus a lot of their attack through the middle. So by having more players in here, you often have a free man, and that's why they've attacked so well this season. So look, as we move up, let's say these players are here. Colwill comes there. Badiashile in the first half, for example, is there, and then Cucurella is there. But essentially, you still have that same shape, just with a keeper dropping in here. And in deep build-up, it works to have an extra man, because oftentimes teams commit and want to press high. But that was a free man on the day against Spurs, and we'll get into that as well.
Right, so as Umir has alluded to, we've got a situation set up on the board here where Chelsea are in their in-possession structure. We want to talk about something that Enzo Maresca did that in this game practically got them complete dominance over the game. I'm going to throw up the passing accuracy in their opposition half and in the opposition final third, and we can see the total of passes played and the percentage of them passes in Tottenham's final third was well better than the Whites. So I just want to talk about how they've got four-man in midfield and how against a 4-1-4-1 this is a massive problem. So Spurs, whenever a team has two central midfielders in deep build-up, which is what a lot of people do nowadays, whether it's a 4-2 or a 3-2, these two eights always press as high as possible, man-marking them, so that it means that the wingers and the forward can go man-to-man with the opposition's build-up. Now, for Chelsea, you have Cole Palmer here on the right-hand side, and he's being man-marked by Basuma. And what this means is that Cole Palmer was dropping into different pockets of space and pulling Basuma away from the central area. So he was having somewhat of a right-sided bias, and then this creates this massive gap that we've seen not just in this game but also for other games for Tottenham, because other teams have manipulated this shape. And we've got this massive gap between the defensive and midfield lines. And we have here is Enzo Fernandez, who was often the spare man. Now, the right centre-half usually was supposed to step up. That's, in principle, what you think a manager has asked them to do. However, what you get with a team like Chelsea is that when this right centre-half would go, which was very rarely in this game for Spurs.
And it was more with Romero.
Yeah, because he's got an aggressive nature. And what you have now is a 3v3 in the defence and in the attack for Chelsea. And Nicholas Jackson is absolutely incredible at spinning off the shoulder, running into the channels. And there was a chance at 2-1 down for Cole Palmer, which he just sliced in the box, which they created from this exact situation. And that was the fullbacks and the 10s pushing a little bit deeper to entice the pressure. And then this amount of space for Nicholas Jackson, this is where he works his best football, creating, facilitating.
And then all of these players late arriving in the box.
So I want you to explain not just why the structure was a huge plus for Chelsea and why it got them so much damage, why it dealt so much damage to Spurs, but I want you to speak about how it was risky, but why Ange Postecoglou maybe never changed throughout the game, and why this was a problem even after the half-time tweaks that was still there.
Yeah, so if we talk about some of Spurs' principles in what they were trying to do, they had Solanke, and especially sort of in deeper build-up from the goal kicks, we saw Solanke press really intensely. We saw all of the pressure really intense from that forward line, and Solanke was often tasked with pressing this player here, Colwill, but you know, he tended to curve his run, and we've seen that from top teams trying to force players down one side. So in doing so, and with Chelsea having this focus on trying to build through the centre, a lot of the play was funneled into areas where there was man-to-man pressure across the pitch like that. Now with Cucurella involved, particularly in the first half, whether or not he had faulty boots or it was the pressure or the pitch, who knows? He didn't slip after he changed his boots.
No.
But yeah, God knows, I'm not sure. Either way, with this pressure here, what we saw from Chelsea was a pass back usually to the keeper trying to find one of these central players. If it was Enzo, for example, he often plays inside himself. What does that mean? It means with his right foot, he likes to go infield. So if he's here, he'll play this pass here. If he's a little bit wider, he'll play the pass into this player. Caicedo, for example, he's a player who spins, he likes to access different angles, and he's very inventive in doing so. So if the ball did go into Caicedo, he was able to find Cucurella in these areas. What we saw actually from the wingers of Spurs was that they were given this difficult job of marking the wide players, but also trying to cover the centre.
Yeah.
So from the goalkeeping situations, what we saw was these two wingers had a really difficult job in trying to cover these areas for these wide players, but also stop the ball into these areas. These wingers for Chelsea did drop deep very often, and I thought Sancho was brilliant at doing so. I've spoken about Sancho's quality before in the past as being somebody who thrives on having the ball in separation. What that means is if he gets the ball here with some space between his player, facing forward, then he can drive. And we saw that happen in the goal that he eventually scored as well. When he did play for Manchester United, for example, I thought he struggled because he had the ball in sort of 1v1 situations here. The player, the opposition defender in front of him, really close, and he didn't have time to gain momentum, gain speed, and change direction. So Enzo Maresca used him really well, and he did really well in dropping into these areas here. And what we saw was when the ball did go to either the keeper or Colwill, even Cucurella at times, they did do well to find these little gaps here, but most importantly, they played very directly into the eights. Palmer, for example, moving into these areas. We saw the double pivot of Chelsea pin these two players. Obviously, they were man-marked, so really oftentimes, we saw them move to one side and move narrow, and if the ball was recycled back to here, for example, this lane was open and then Chelsea could go. So it was very smart from Chelsea in terms of their performance, particularly from the individual players, to move the man-marked their man markers into different areas to open passing lanes directly into the eights. These players were really good at dropping in, enticing players onto them, and then this man was free and Jackson was able to spin behind. So if we combine everything together, the deep build-up, the the shape, this space being free, their principles of finding the eights, and then the man marking from Spurs, then that's kind of why you get that picture of the first half of Chelsea being so dominant.
Yeah.
And it continuing with better players for certain roles. For example, Badiashile, naturally a left-footed player playing on this side, struggled a little bit to access certain players. You know, this pass is easy for a right footer, and he's better at defending in these channels left-sided here. Cucurella struggled a little bit with that pressure from Brennan Johnson. So Badiashile on that side, a left footer, and with Cucurella's movement, pinning Johnson a bit. They did look better, but the principles were the same throughout the game, and that was really impressive from Chelsea. And yeah, Spurs didn't do anything to counteract that from a shape perspective, did they?
Okay, now we just want to touch on how the man-marking troubles of Spurs against Chelsea also had a massive say in the third goal for Chelsea, which was effectively the goal that turned the tide completely and pretty much won them the 3 points overall. So, as you can see right here, we've got a situation, and you can imagine if Cole Palmer's on the ball here, we've got a situation where Spurs are defending deep in a 4-4-2, and this player right here is Marc Cucurella. We spoke before about how the changes going into the second half weren't necessarily tactics related, but personnel related. And I think it's key that Enzo Maresca is valuing these left-sided eights or right-sided eights as players who can make these late darts into the penalty area. It's why we've seen Enzo Fernandez score a lot of goals recently. Obviously,
why they won the penalty as well, by the way.
Yeah, why they won the penalty. So it's very key that in the second half, I think Enzo Maresca looks at Marc Cucurella as a very intelligent late runner. He's got the energy to always go in. And I want to speak about how in this situation right here, you can imagine if this is Timo Werner, which it was on this occasion, as Chelsea come forward with the ball, Cole Palmer's on the ball, Spurs are retreating defensively. Now, because you've got a man-marking situation, it means that these players are often pinned, which means the pinning is basically to drag someone or to hold them in a position when they are man-marking you and to hold them back. So if this is Timo Werner and he's tracking the left eight of Marc Cucurella, he's coming, well, he's a left back, but he's playing left eight, and that's why he has such a high position and why Timo Werner's got such a reserve position for being a winger, theoretically. And what it means is that Marc Cucurella was dragging Timo Werner with that man-marking responsibility deep into the area, and that meant that this space opened up again, which we talked about before. Enzo arrives here and he is a brilliant volley, and he hits it into the bottom corner. And that is just an example of how the man-marking situation that Spurs had on Chelsea and how Chelsea manufactured these chances with the 4 men in midfield and players arriving late into the spaces, not only for the penalty but for the goal. And I want you to touch on, just to top it all off, how interesting this was from Chelsea and why it worked so much.
Yeah, I think if we just take it a touch back, what we saw in the first half were situations in which this player was Enzo Fernandez, who was the natural midfielder. He was already there and he was staying in those areas. Obviously, he was free in those areas, but it meant that Brennan Johnson in that first half could push up a little bit here. Yeah. And then, look, even though he was free, sometimes Romero pushed on here, but sometimes they tried to block the space with other players. Now, a really interesting thing that I've noticed in football, and it's one of the most important sort of tactical concepts, is about the idea of arriving in space. I think we touched on it actually in the last tactical analysis board piece that we did. But by arriving, it was the Arsenal one actually, but by arriving in places, you can receive the ball in valuable areas more easily than if you just stay in those areas. And what we saw is, by having a left back do that, the winger associated with them is going to be inclined to follow them. Now, that means you lose your attacking threat, and I thought Spurs' rest attack, so their players ready to attack when you don't have the ball, their setup was poor. I think one criticism I'll make of Solanke, and I don't know if it's Solanke specific or if it's Ange specific, is Solanke gets involved in these defensive duties, I feel like far too much for me personally. So he's involved in sort of these areas down here. You've got Werner even push back on your left back in sort of central midfield or right sided midfield areas. And I know you're trying to protect a lead, but you've got really fast counter attackers. The way that Liverpool and Slot have done things is leave a couple players here and then cover some space. Yeah. And perhaps they don't have the personnel to do that, but I would think someone like Papa Matasar, someone like Basuma covering space in there, someone like Kulusevski or Maddison, but sort of more physical players in there covering space and leaving some of these players up to attack would give you sort of a more favourable balance. Yeah. But with Cucurella arriving in there, Werner on him, Solanke deep, you had really nice pressure applied by Chelsea.
You could just see in the shape right now how this meant that Chelsea had so much of the ball.
Yeah, and you
because of
get
how
stuck
much
there, don't you?
Yeah, and they just couldn't get out.
Especially in a home game, I think that adds to that sort of criticism, that nervousness in the crowd, and it's all piling on a little bit. And I know in bad moments you kind of want to hold on to your lead, and you kind of want to, there'll be a mental aspect to it, to the game. But I'd love to see something like, and this is just on the fly, like this is nothing super specific, but I'd love to see something a bit more
aggressive
or more focused on blocking the space, even if you go.
Did you think it was Ange Postecoglou often gets this idea thrown at him that he needs to adapt, and I thought in the second half Spurs retreated far too away from the principles. I thought that the Spurs that we've talked about as being fast, counter-attacking, you watch the City game, you watch them even at home against the big teams. It felt like in the second half, whether or not it was instructed or not, it felt like the mentality did start to creep in and they sank a lot deeper into the
half. And I think you lose both of your centre-backs and you lose players who are very front-footed, able to step into midfield.
It's a good point.
I think that explains it. But I do think that if people want, Ange to adapt by being more pragmatic, sitting deep and removing your outlets from their best positions and not defending only in those areas isn't the way to do it. I think there's ways to do it, and it's probably by amending certain pressing schemes higher up the pitch and having a better sort of zonal block. But I don't think that this was like an adaptation on
it was
purpose.
More of a mental we need to protect.
But it didn't look like a typical
No, that's
Ange
what I
Spurs
thought.
team, for sure.
I think they lost all thought of what they were trying to do, where they were in the game, how much they were thriving in the first 15 minutes.
And testament to Chelsea, because they kind of almost forced that upon them a little bit.
No, the last time Chelsea were 2-0 down that early was against Leeds United in 1996 with 11 minutes played. So the fact that they've won this game away at Tottenham is incredible, and testament to how good this Chelsea team is developing for the youngest team on average in the Premier League. Enzo Maresca's galvanised the squad beautifully, and we've been a big fan of him, and long may it continue, because I don't want Liverpool to win the league. Right, thank you very much for watching the latest episode of the Overlap Breakdown Tactics, and we'll be back next week to cover the Manchester derby, so stick around for that one. Thank you very much.